And I'm going to share my screen. So welcome everybody. First of all, I hope everybody is safe and healthy. We're still dealing with quite a year, and it's complicated by a lot of activity politically this week and so forth. So a lot going on, a lot of reasons that people can be stressed. But I hope this is the best portion of your day where you can have some good conversation, learn from each other, and just enjoy some interaction, even if it is through a computer screen. So I always like to start off just mentioning, particularly for new people, a little bit about conscious capitalism in Indianapolis. The group is an international organization, but we have a chapter here, and this is our purpose. We help Indianapolis companies discover, embrace, and embed the principles of conscious capitalism. We have a number of what we call champions, and those are the companies that support us financially, and many of them are involved in our organization as well. So we always want to recognize them and say thank you. And today we've got kind of an interesting theme, and let me back up just a second because it's kind of important to give this a little bit of context. We started off the year with an amazing event in January at CAR Global, where we had over 100 people attend. And that's generally what we've done, is we've had a lot of in-person events over the last 3 years since our founding. But then, of course, everything changed. And we quickly pivoted. We quickly started doing virtual events. And we first focused on COVID because everybody was trying to figure out what others were doing related to COVID. And so we had a series of events. And then in the fall, we have had what we've called our healing series. There's so many reasons, as I was citing earlier, that, people are uptight about 2020 in general. And so we said, let's try to do some things that help us realize, kind of what we're going through, the support we can get, and how we're learning from each other. So we started the series off with an author, Raj Sisodio. He was one of the co-authors of the Conscious Capitalism book that started the whole movement. Then we had a session on unconscious bias. And then we had another author and business owner, a CEO of PayActive, Safwan Shah. And today we're going to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. And we've titled that The Way of the Jedi. Some of you may be familiar with that acronym that throws in the word justice so that we can have kind of a clever way to talk about it. And then we have a fun event that I'll talk about at the end for December, where we're just simply going to look back and try to do our best to celebrate 2020. So again, a little background. Now, let me introduce you to some panelists we have today. For this topic, it is such an interesting topic, and I think so many businesses are kind of struggling with what do we do about these issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in our businesses. Obviously, there's been a lot of activity, a lot of unrest this year. So how do we react to that? How do we learn from that? And what kind of action do we take? And so, we've gathered some leaders from several different companies to tell us what they do. So let me just give you a quick introduction, and then I'm going to ask each one of them to take some time to tell us a little bit about their own views and what they're doing in their organization, and then we'll have some time for some Q&A at the end. So one of the first things you may mention is that Kristen is a popular name today. So we have Kristen Matha. Kristen leads DEI efforts at Ice Miller. She's also got background at NCAA in this area. Kristen Lampkin is at CAR Global, rather new there, so she can tell us how she is starting up a new program at CAR Global, but has lots of experience in the community with this topic. Jason Gonzalez is a leader at Delta Faucet, where he leads the committee on diversity and inclusion. And then Kristen Cohn is a business owner. I think she's owner, but I think her official title is head honcho at Silver in the City. And many of you may be familiar with her store down on Mass Ave or the one up in Carmel. So I am going to stop sharing my screen. And why don't I turn it over to Kristen Matha first. If you would open us up and tell us a little bit about your program and what you do at Eismiller.
Thank you, Pat. Well, first, thank you all for the opportunity to share some information about our work at Eismiller and the strategy that we have been pursuing. A little bit about kind of the scope and scale of Eismiller, and then in terms of how that strategy could extrapolate to other organizations. We have just over 600 team members, 7 offices across the eastern part of the United States, with significant geographical differences. Obviously, the challenges and opportunities from a diversity, equity, and inclusion space that our New York City office is facing is quite different than Columbus, Ohio versus Chicago, Illinois, so on and so forth. So quite a wide breadth there. And then we're headquartered here in Indianapolis, so still very kind of informed by Midwestern culture. A core tenet of our diversity and inclusion strategy, and this I think relates obviously to Pat said an earlier discussion that you all had around unconscious bias. And that issue is one that we've recognized just the pervasive impact that it has on our talent management systems and the career development opportunities for historically underrepresented attorneys and staff. And so when thinking about historically underrepresented attorneys in the legal industry, we're talking about women, people of color, LGBTQ+ folks, and individuals with disabilities. And just real quickly, for those that maybe implicit bias or unconscious bias is a new term, this is something we all have. Our brains need to process over 11 million bits of information at any given moment. So our brain is wired to use mental shortcuts. And the problem is that those shortcuts are heavily influenced by our unconscious bias. And those are essentially the social norms or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions. They're activated involuntarily, and not necessarily with our awareness, but they're a lens through which we see the world and a lens through which we make decisions. And unfortunately, these biases can be based on negative stereotypes or unearned positive stereotypes. And they can creep into our workplace and cause us to make favorable decisions for some and career limiting decisions for others. And there's an especially, I guess, pernicious type of bias that we're really focused on, and that is affinity bias. And when I say affinity bias, think birds of a feather flock together. And this is a bias where we are more likely to want to work with, extend trust, and just overall have a greater positive regard, more empathy towards people who are more like us. And when we find ourselves in an organization where folks are underrepresented, and in the legal industry, the vast majority are still white men, there is a tendency to gravitate and share opportunities with others who are more like them. And so we end up just replicating and getting into this kind of prototyping, and therefore the historically underrepresented folks are disproportionately excluded for the opportunities they need in order to develop their careers. And we all know that those opportunities are critically important. And so, our approach has been twofold. One, we have to educate folks. We have to make folks aware of the concept of unconscious bias, push them to take personal commitment of it, and go out and take a Harvard Implicit Association test, find out about what your biases are, and then really invest the time and effort to change your habits, change your behaviors, to mitigate the impact on these biases in the workplace. But we know we're humans, and it is very difficult to change those habits, especially if they've been developed over decades of a career. And so where we're really thoughtful in trying to move to is redesigning our systems to be more objective, to be more transparent, and ultimately more fair. And then when we're rebuilding these talent management systems, we're doing it with an eye towards implementing bias interrupters. And bias interrupters are essentially tweaks to basic business systems that interrupt unconscious bias in the course of doing that work. So if we, if individuals participating in that system, either haven't done the work or fall faulty to their biases, we're kind of creating this backup that will help people make better, more fair, more objective decisions in these talent management practices. And I highly recommend the Work-Life Law Center, which is out of the University of California, Hastings College of the Law. They have a multitude of free resources that break down how bias surfaces in compensation, in performance evaluations, in recruiting and hiring. And these are ready-made tools that you can incorporate directly into your systems and build educational models around as well. Google Rework is also a great tool where they have shared and open sourced their approaches for redesigning talent management systems with an eye towards mitigating bias and making sure more fair outcomes. At the end of the day, unconstrained discretion leads to subtle discrimination. Unconstrained discretion leads to subtle discrimination. So if the way we hire people is, a subjective interview process where folks can ask whatever questions they want, inconsistent questions from one candidate to the next, you're not tracking any metrics, and there's individual notions of what fit is and what culture fit is, that is ripe for bias. That is ripe for unfairness. And so what we've gone to is an interview process that is using structured interviews where candidates are asked a consistent set of questions and there's clear criteria that's used for assessing those answers. And we've also defined what we mean by fit. What are the knowledge, skills, and abilities? What are those attributes we want folks to bring to our workplace? So then we're assessing folks on that during the recruiting process. And so it's all about creating structure, transparency, and building metrics to determine, are the changes we're making leading to the outcomes we want? Another area where we've done this is in the performance evaluation system. Here we had, again, a subjective process. We lacked specific advancement criteria for the position. We moved to a competency-based evaluation model. So now everyone understands, here are the unwritten rules for success. Here are the knowledge and skills and abilities you need to be able to show. Here's the type of work you need to be able to have demonstrated your ability to do in order to progress. So it's about leveling the playing field, system by system, again, making those unwritten rules for success known so everyone has a chance to lead to their fullest potential in the organization. And at the end of the day, I can't say enough, but create transparency as much as possible. And then we need to hold folks accountable through metrics and measurement and continuing to do that process and evaluating all of our systems across the board. And that's what we continue to do today. So again, thank you for the opportunity to share a bit about the approach that we're taking at ICE Miller, and happy to answer questions when we get to the Q&A portion.
Great stuff. I'm excited because I'm learning a lot already. So, I should have mentioned earlier, if you have questions along the way, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll try to attack them at the end. One ground rule I'm going to place, and again, I probably should have mentioned it at first, is I think we should stay away from the political climate today. This really is set up so that these people can share kind of what they do so that we can all learn and hopefully have better ways to work it out. But it's obviously, there's a lot going on with the elections, and I don't think it's fair to them to ask them questions about how that might affect their roles and things. So let's kind of stay away from that, but I think almost anything else is probably free game. So feel free to use the chat, and I'm sure they'll get rolling at the end. So with that, why don't we turn to Kristen Lampkin, and why don't you tell us a little more about CAR and what you're doing there?
Perfect. Can everyone hear me well? Okay, perfect. My name is Kristen Lampkin. I am the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Program Manager at CAR, and I am new to CAR. So I have been with CAR for 2 months, but I'm not new to the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. I've done that in my previous roles, as well as, like Pat shared, throughout the community with different organizations. And being here at CAR for 2 months, and even in the interviewing process, diversity, equity, and inclusion is important to me professionally and personally. I believe it's my purpose and what I'm supposed to be doing. And so I'm excited to really do that within CAR. And so one of the things that attracted me and made me excited for this opportunity is that CAR, as their leadership and as an organization, they recognize the need for someone to be actually overseeing and working on the strategy and the efforts. In this last 6 months, we have seen several organizations across the United States and global implementing someone to oversee diversity and inclusion, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. And some people may be unfamiliar with the equity portion ad, because often, and I'm sure Kristen and the others on the line that are part of the panel, you often heard diversity and inclusion leader. But the equity portion has been added. And prior to coming to CAR, my title was diversity and inclusion. And then when I came on, I saw they added equity. Again, it showed that the organization understands the importance of having an even level field and overcoming barriers for those that are part of underrepresented or groups. So in hiring me, that was part of the strategy, having someone oversee the DEI strategy. And so what I do is I am helping develop and deliver CAR's diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. I'm leading and executing delivery of initiatives and implementing them on an ongoing basis. And so that for me was exciting, to come on to an organization that has started doing the work. We are in the beginning journey of this. I always share with people, when it comes to DEI, this is not a sprint, it is a marathon. It is always changing and growing. And as we all recognize, in the last year, it's even more a need for us to really focus on this topic. And really not just make it an initiative, but really make it part of our DNA as organizations. And so coming on the CAR, they had started some of the work for me already. We had actually surveyed our employees. We sent out a survey, pulse survey, getting a pulse of I'm sorry, I see that someone asked, and we'll definitely cover that, Kimberly, about equity and equality. But coming on to CAR, they had pulse surveys that they already had sent out to the whole organization, getting a pulse of where do their employees feel they stand when it comes to inclusion, diversity, and equity. And so that to me, again, showed that the organization is truly serious about this. And they don't just want to make decisions based off of what other organizations are doing. They really want to see what their employees wanted, what the employees are seeing, and what are the areas they see as opportunities. So that was something that was great to come on to see that they had done that already. And then, as we know, this has been a very challenging year when it comes to a lot of things, when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially just being honest in the Black community. And so it was refreshing to see that Jim Hallett, who is our CEO, had already addressed some of those issues that are taking place, letting the employees know that as an organization, we are doing things, but we haven't truly took a stance and let our employees know boldly how we feel. And so I want to share with you all one of the things that they shared with the organization prior to me coming, of where CAR Global stands. So CAR Global sees value in each and every person. We remain committed to providing a working environment that does not tolerate discrimination under any circumstances. We foster a culture of open dialogue while we listen and learn first, and provide increased resources, outlets for sharing and support for team members of all races, genders, sexual orientation, abilities, and religions. Again, this was part of us taking a stance and letting the organization and our employees know that this is not, again, just a one and done of us showing what we're about, but we're really implementing that. And so part of the strategy that was already implemented prior to me coming, the leadership, specifically Lisa Price, who is our CPO, actually shared that we are going to have open forums, which they had already started, where employees and leaders can discuss the current events that are taking place, sharing their personal views, and offering how we can do better. So that had already started in the process. Another thing that we're doing is implementing quarterly speaker series, where we're going to feature internal and external speakers that are talking about, like Kristen shared earlier, unconscious bias, microaggressions. What does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean? Where does that stand for the organization? Again, and then continuing to create and support. So we have 2 employee resource groups currently, Women of CAR, and then we also have Women of Technology. And we're going to be implementing 5 additional employee resource groups. Now, this is a great way for our employees to feel like they have a safe space and where they can get educated and bring awareness as well. And in these groups, it's also going to allow us to help bring leadership in those organizations. Again, I shared we did a pulse survey. So that was something that we already implemented to see where our employees stand. This is a good way to kind of also see from a metric standpoint. In the beginning of the year, this is where employees felt how we were as an organization. Where do we see a year from now that the organization is seen as? And then one of the things we were already doing is bias/diversity training that's mandatory for all of our employees. And this was a good way for us to enhance our mandatory training and making sure employees understood what behaviors are okay and what behaviors are not. So those are some of the things that we have started doing, and as well as moving forward. Kristen brought up a very good point. When it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, it is very important that you look at what does the talent, how are you recruiting, retaining, and promoting talent? I always say when it comes to DEI, it's important that organizations look at it from 5 pillars. So the 5 pillars are workforce, workplace, marketing, community, workplace, workforce, and then whether you call it procurement or vendors. And one thing I always explain, although we have these 5 pillars, if you have someone leading the efforts in DEI, they're not responsible for all 5 pillars. The reality is that they are collaborating with a lot of parts of the business, because again, this should not be the efforts of one individual. It needs to be the efforts of the whole entire organization putting forth effort. And one thing here at CAR, our executive leadership has set a stance that this is something that they're not just saying that we need to just have as small little initiative. This is something we need to implement in DNA of our organization. And that is what we're doing in our journey. We're spending time listening, and then we're also implementing these strategies. Recently, yesterday, we announced to our organization that, my position and who I am within the organization and my role. And part of that is we're rolling out Voices of CAR. Often when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, we look at the differences, but we don't realize we all have so many similarities and things in common. And so our Voices of CAR is going to allow our employees, 2 employees a quarter, share something about themselves, whether it's about their family, about their role, about their passion, about projects. It allows us to get to know each other. Because we call each other our CAR squad, we want to know our CAR squad and our family and their experiences, and learn about the things that make us similar more than focusing on the things that make us so different. So those are some of the things that we are focusing on, and our strategies towards what we're going to do, as well as including some target metrics as well, which we can talk about a little later. But we're excited to be part of this conversation. I'm excited to be part of CAR Global, and I'm excited to see you all here present today, wanting to be the change within your organizations and implementing strategies and initiatives to really, for us to make an impact and change the world that we see today. So thank you so much, Pat, and everyone for having me in CAR Global.
Thank you, Kristen. It's great, great stuff. I love the pillars and some of the programs that you're putting in place. Only a few months into the job, so
yes.
good
Busy
stuff.
times, but good things.
Yeah, good. All right, well let's turn to Jason. Jason, tell us a little about your role. You have a little different role in how it's handled at Delta, and I'd love to hear about that and all the things that you're doing in your own perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Pat. So we'll try to give a little bit of a different perspective as we heard here a little bit. Obviously, a lot of great things being done by a lot of companies in our community, and it's really exciting to learn. I'm super excited about getting the recording of this, because both Kristens have said a lot of things that I wanted to take notes on, but didn't want to be furiously scribbling. My name is Jason Gonzalez, and I work at Delta Faucet Company. I am the Senior Director of Trade Business Development at Delta, meaning that I manage, on the trade side of the business, all of our segments except for our showrooms. I've been at Delta for about 12 years, and about 5 years of that I've been here in Indianapolis. Before that I was in Florida. And I've done a couple of different roles here at Delta. And a few years ago, Delta came to me and asked me to be part of a group. And this group was tasked with really learning about what should our journey for diversity, equity, and inclusion be. where should we be in our process, right? So this is about 4 years ago. And what we did is we set out to learn about what does the industry look like, what do our peers in the plumbing industry look like, what do our customers look like, what does our community look like in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we did a lot of research. We interviewed companies that were similar size, smaller, bigger, companies within our own industry, companies outside of the industry, and also did a lot of research for, just diversity research in general. What do companies do that has led to good success? What companies have done that has led to some failures, in this space? Once we finalized a lot of that research, we really put together an action plan to present to our executive staff and said, hey, here's the value of kind of getting better at this, and here's how we think we should proceed. And to be frank, it didn't really land as powerfully as perhaps we thought it would. Not because there was resistance, there actually wasn't a lot of resistance, but we are a Midwestern company, right? We are the #1 faucet manufacturer in the country. We are a global manufacturer, but we are largely a Midwestern company, right? We are very nice, we're very polite. Walking around the hallway, you would think that it's a very welcoming place, and by and large it is. So when we presented what we should do for diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think the overall kind of belief in the organization was, hey, we're already there, right? We're a welcoming place. People love to work here. We have super low turnover, and all of those things are true. So then we went about the work of trying to figure out kind of what Chris had mentioned at the beginning as to what are some of our blind spots, right? What are some of these biases that perhaps we haven't recognized that have created, maybe some systemic issues, right? So we started implementing a lot of small, what I'll say, small tests within our business. At that point, I was asked to lead our leadership team having to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Actually, kind of at a very similar time as when we were starting out, kind of building out this conscious capitalism here in Indianapolis. So I feel like it's been a similar kind of timeline, for us to kind of grow in these different spaces. When I was asked to lead this leadership team, we decided that some of the things that we wanted to focus on was trying to listen more intently to our employees, really putting a focus on what are the people that work here experience every day. So we implemented a variety of things. We started putting together pulse surveys. We've always had surveys here at Delta, but we didn't really ask a lot of really insightful questions around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We didn't ask a lot of questions around, whether or not people felt like they were being heard, whether or not they felt like they could bring their whole self to work, etc. So we started asking better questions. And that's one thing that we did. Another thing that we did is we started creating what we call listening sessions. And these sessions are relatively small sessions, somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 10 people. In this particular year, with kind of the Zoom and Teams world that we live in, we use Teams primarily at Delta. So we actually limit our sessions to 8 people because 9 people show up in the screen, right? So we have a moderator and then eight participants. And what we do is we actually ask very basic questions. What do you think diversity, equity, inclusion means to you? What has been your experience with diversity, equity, and inclusion? And what can Delta Faucet Company do better to move forward in this space? At first, we kind of got some pretty timid responses, I guess I will say. And as we continue to do these, and we started showing people that action comes from you sharing during these sessions, we were able to get a lot more participation. To give you an example of some of the things that have come out of these is we created a structure based on our charter that we initially wrote, and we focused on 2 specific areas: workplace engagement and then recruiting and retention. So we really looked at recruiting and retention as kind of how do we get more diverse over time, right? We have a couple of issues at Delta, honestly. I mean, we have low turnover. So because you have low turnover, it's kind of hard, right, to change the demographics of the organization as a whole very quickly. So that's one area that we put a lot of action items in place. We started thinking about how do we go about finding talent? Where do we Where do we find the talent? How do we advertise for opportunities that exist within Delta? Do people in our community even know that we're here, right? We actually found that a lot of people in Indianapolis did not know the Delta Faucet Company is just north of Indianapolis. And that was a bit surprising to us. But we started really kind of taking a hard look at how do we find talent? How do we make ourselves more approachable? You know, how do we find talent in different places that we haven't looked for talent before? And then how do we retain the folks that are here, you know, to make sure that we're continuing to drive change? The other area that we focused on was around workplace engagement. And workplace engagement was really built on this idea of inclusive culture. And how do we make sure that the people that already work here feel like they can bring their whole self to work, right? That's kind of the phrase that always comes up within Delta is, can I bring my whole self to work? So that team went about doing a variety of things that we've heard already thus far. We have things like speaker series, we have things like these listening sessions, and we also have created these workplace communities. And these workplace communities have been awesome for us. You know, for us, the belief is that we think workplace communities should be organic. Our goal was never to say, hey, we're going to go create a community for women. But we did have a group that was created very organically. Women in our organization participated with one of our customers and in kind of a, you know, women leadership focused session that lasted a couple of days. And after that, there was a whole lot of energy around, man, we really should be doing something here at Delta. So we started going about the work of figuring out what that looks like. What does it mean to be a workplace community, and how should we contribute to the broader organization, right? We then went about the work of putting together some guidelines for what does it look like to be a workplace community, right? For one, we wanted to make sure that just because you have a workplace community of, say, for example, women in leadership, that wasn't an exclusive situation, right? So there's actually men that participate in that. I've been to a lot of their sessions, and they're actually really, really cool. So it's been a really welcoming place for a lot of people. We also have some groups that have created from that community. So working parents, which is not obviously exclusive to women, but working parents. And we've gotten together and shared all kinds of things, even like cooking sessions. There's a couple of very fancy videos of me baking bread out there, sharing some recipes. So I can forward it on to y'all if you want to learn how to make really mediocre bread. But what was awesome about it is that we started seeing these communities prop up. And then more importantly, we saw these communities contributing to the actual fabric of the organization. So a couple of the tangible things that came out of that, we have restructured our parental leave policy, for example. It used to be very driven towards, hey, women get these rights and then men don't, or families that adopt perhaps don't get the same, and a variety of different things, right? It didn't necessarily seem like we went out of our way to be exclusive, but we were able to identify those as opportunities. So in the process of growing, we've been able to change a lot of our policies. What I'll share that we are doing at the moment is that after we wrote our initial charter, we've learned a lot of things. We've made a lot of mistakes. We have tried to engage with the community as best we can. We've tried to deliver a great environment for our employees, but we've also seen that there's some limitations to how we were structured. So right now we're actually going through a process of changing our DE&I leadership, and we really kind of try to get that involved all the way to the top. So for us, starting next year, diversity, equity, and inclusion will be one of the most important things that we deliver to the organization. On our X matrix, our X matrix of priorities, it'll be our number one most important thing that we do next year. And the new leader of our diversity, equity, and inclusion will no longer be me at the beginning of the year. It'll actually be our president. So it'll go all the way to the top, and we'll be able to really get a lot better engagement and decision-making by showing that it is something that's important. I think Kristen Lampkin mentioned that this is something that needs to be in the fabric of everything that we do, right? So we wanted to make sure that it wasn't something that's just done at, as an aside to what you do, but it is something that matters, and it is something that we should use every single day for every single decision. So I'd be happy to share more as we get some questions, but that's kind of a brief history of what Delta is about and kind of what we're trying to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. We certainly have made a lot of mistakes. So for those of you that are starting to engage in this process, I encourage you that it's not perfect all the time, but it's always worth it. So, stay at it. And if there's anything that I can do to help in the process, please, by all means, reach out.
Thank you, Jason. Yeah, I think it's interesting. A little bit different approach at Delta. It's tough when you have to step down, but when the CEO's taking your place, that's pretty impressive. So obviously you are passing it on in good hands. So
I try to trade so I can become the CEO, but they didn't take that.
Yeah, you may want to rethink that. All right, well, let's go to our final panelist, and that's Kristen Cohn, and a very different situation. She owns stores at Silver in the City. She is live at her store right outside of Mass Ave downtown. So Kristen, let's go to you. Tell us some of the things that your organization has done.
Sure. I want to say thank you to everyone who's already spoken. I'm learning so much, and thank you for including small business. It looks a lot different than corporate. I opened Silver in the City 20 years ago here on Mass Ave, which was known as being a very inclusive community, which is why I chose to locate it here. And part of our value and our mission this entire time has been to provide a welcoming, fun, and informative environment for everyone in which to work and visit and shop. So that's a value that we've long held. At Silver in the City, depending on the time of year or whether there's a pandemic, we have about 12 full-time employees and about 24-ish part-time employees. As head honcho, I'm the CEO, I'm the CFO, I'm the CMO, I'm the DE&I person. And, without having a corporate structure through which to develop these skills and have people helping to mentor and develop them, it's a lot of just being entirely self-taught. Of course, it comes down to the nice thing about being a small organization is it really comes down to what my values are and just making sure that those values are what are shared with our company as a whole and making sure that those values are upheld. Speaking from in front of the store, I think illustrates a huge point in that we are a street level business. We're very forward facing, and customers is sort of the first area where we really take a close look at our diversity and on our inclusion. So I've mentioned how, we're committed to always providing a welcoming environment for people to come in, that they can bring their whole selves to our store, and we encourage it and we support it and we love it. Definitely, more recently, we've definitely taken steps to include, we've started doing quarterly unconscious bias training, and taking that training and applying it to our sales floor and thinking about standard practices that we execute, with every customer that comes in, but understanding how that might feel for certain customers and whether that is coming through as a bias. And so I've enjoyed having sort of fresh lens to look through and to be able to think about, things that we just felt since we're applying it to everybody, it is not biased, but realizing that for some, it does come across as biased. And so being able to take a close look at what's happening as people are coming into our business is so important to us. So really putting that focus on customers and making sure that that experience continues to grow and develop, to identify biases and address them. Through our team, like I said, we have a very small team, and the growth of that team right now, we're kind of at a pause button for that. We value creating space for our team, again, to bring their whole selves, their most genuine selves, which has been a really fantastic environment to work in. Making sure we're respecting one another, helping our team adjust to using preferred names and pronouns, even if there are shifts in those preferences during the course of someone's tenure with us. One of the areas for growth we've definitely identified is working on bringing a more diverse pool of applicants for our open positions. That's definitely an area for growth that we are putting a lot of intention and focus into. Being a small business, definitely learning about affinity bias is something that that happens. You know, we're a very small, intimate group. We work very closely together. So definitely, you know, we're drawn to hiring people we feel an affinity to. And so working just to grow beyond that when it is time for us to grow again. I really appreciated Kristen Mather's reflection on the interview process structure and the transparency and metrics. And we have been, again, implementing those practices, but looking more deeply at them to see what else we can be doing. Also, how we can support our more diverse employees who sometimes have struggles with family, with finances, with housing, with dependable transportation for work, and making sure that we're trying to make it as equitable a playing field as we can. Really, where I feel a big part of sharing our DE&I values comes through with our voice. And I think that's one of the reasons, maybe why we're brought to the table today, is that we do, you know, we have, and I see Josh Drivers here today, and really we worked together in 2015 when he launched his Open for Service campaign to allow businesses to publicly stand up and say, you know, we welcome all, you know, everybody's welcome to come and do business with us. And going through that practice really opened us up to being transparent about our values and beliefs to the public, and publicly sharing those, using our position as a small business, as a member of the community, to vocalize our support for inclusivity, social justice, racial justice, you know, even at the risk of disenfranchising customers. You know, it has still been something that we continue to grow upon and build on. You know, if we have customers who do not want us nor appreciate our making public our values, you know, again, that's a risk I take, but, you know, I accept that that might cause some people to choose not to do business with us further. But I think when we lead by our values, having those values challenged definitely provides us with an opportunity to reflect on why we have those values in the first place, why people might object to those, and, you know, think about whether we need to reevaluate our positions, you know, listening, reflecting, and looking inward. But definitely, you know, being asked to remain silent is not an option, and it's not one we practice. We actively do share our voice, share the voices of others, and work to kind of use our position in the community to stand up and speak out. And we hope that by doing so, again, we're helping more people in the community to do so. And also our employees have said, you know, that again, this is part of what makes them feel valued, is seeing that we will be outspoken in, you know, standing up for them, for protecting rights. And that's one thing that we can do, you know, again, without having an HR department, without having a D&I VP, you know, it's just sort of the ways that a small business can sort of pivot to practice their values and share those values.
That's great, Kristen. You know, I really appreciate the way that, you know, you have chosen consciously to share your values with the community. And I know for a fact that that has positively been reflected in your reputation and your brand for your business. So we're also glad we included a small business today. So we've got a few minutes for questions. I think one that came in was about kind of the difference between equality and equity. And I think Kristen Lampkin, you were going to address that one. You want to take a shot at that? That's a common question that comes up.
Yes, and often people mix up the two as well. And it's just training our sort of understanding what that looks like. And so when you think of equality and equity, they both want fairness. And often the misperception of equity is that you want others to have less than. And that's not the case. So when it comes to equity, organizations are doing things to help those that maybe need a little bit more because maybe they are underrepresented in the organization. So for instance, implementing training for, like for instance, I've worked for organizations that have had an actual program for women to help them in their development. Some other best practices that you see in organizations is that they recognize they need more people of color and women in leadership. So then they start assigning actual mentors from the executives to have more visibility within the organization. And so I think often people get the misperception that equity means less than, but it's not. It's trying to really have fairness. And there's a great picture illustration I wish I could show you all that Kimberly, you may have seen before too, that demonstrates it so that you can see that it's just making sure that we are implementing processes and implementing programs to make sure that we are having fairness and giving some people that may need more so that they are able to have an equal fairness and equal opportunity to be able to be successful. Because the reality is, we all know that everyone is not given equality, right? And so you have to have equity to get there. And I definitely want any of the other panelists to chime in on, things that you all are doing as well.
Any other comments on that one?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind chiming in. I think one of the things, we actually worked through this in our company. We decided, one day somebody decided we were gonna not call it D&I, we were gonna call it DE&I, but not everyone that was involved was on the same E, right? There were people that wanted to be around equality and people that wanted to be around equity. So for me, I would say that the way that we've talked about it in our company is equality really is about making sure that everyone has the same opportunities, right? Making sure that everyone has, access to the same jobs, et cetera, right? But the problem with kind of that thought process and why it's sometimes incomplete is because not everyone is in the same frame of mind, right? So one example of that would be, we have changed the way that we write our job descriptions when we post them out. So there actually is a program that goes through and it tells you how kind of biased your job description is, right? I would love to remember what it's called. I don't remember it off the top of my head, but I can find it to follow up. But the point is that our HR department went out and researched and then found this opportunity to kind of review all of our job descriptions. Some people are harder than others on themselves when they go to apply. And I'll make a huge gross generalization here, but typically men are less likely to think, oh, I don't meet all these criteria, so I'm not going to apply, right? Whereas there's a lot of other folks, whether it be minorities or women, that will look at a job description and say, oh, I don't meet all of these criteria, I will not apply, right? So being able to remove a lot of these barriers helps you with getting a better pool. So that is kind of an active thing that you can do in terms of equity to make sure that you're getting, equality, right? Real access to opportunities. So without that extra help, as Kristen was talking about, it's really difficult to get to what we would call equal opportunity, equal access to those opportunities, right?
And I noticed that Nathan chimed in and said you're talking about Textio. He's got a link there that gives people some guidance on it.
Thank you, Nathan. That's a good thing about having like 4 or so people here from Delta.
There's a couple other questions. Let's see if we can get to them. One from Leslie is about how important is it for associates to have the conversations. I think each speaker has talked about just the importance of conversations. And what advice do you have for those that might be uncomfortable initiating those discussions? So maybe Kristen Mathen, maybe you want to take a shot at that one.
Sure. I think it's a couple of things in terms of trying to create dialogue, around whether, coming out of the murder of George Floyd over the summer and trying to have candid conversations about anti-Blackness and systemic racism in our workplaces. A few things to keep in mind. One, you never want to put your marginalized team members in a place where they're having to teach people. That is not their job. That is additional labor that you're putting upon them and putting them in a really difficult position. And often they are asked to speak on behalf of their entire identity. And it's a recipe for I think, disaster, in my opinion. And so when trying to create these spaces for dialogue, one of the things we did at ICE Miller, we launched a book club, which is entirely optional for folks to participate in. And we started with Dr. Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And we went, had an already developed book club discussion question list. And what we did was we created community agreements. And I'll send this to Pat afterwards, but there was a a great article published in Harvard Business Review leading up to the election in terms of how to engage in dialogue around these issues. And there's a lot of best practices out there around creating these community agreements in terms of how are we going to come together and respect each other in this dialogue, but also recognize that, you know, people are hurting. People are you know, afraid. They are afraid for their families, and it's a very very difficult space to navigate. And so, whether that is, you know, are you in a, you know, what's the overall maturity of your organization to have these discussions? Do you need to bring in an external moderator to help facilitate in the event that, you know, they become you know, extremely difficult? Or, you know, depending upon where your organization is at the maturity space, is this something where, you know, folks that have really invested time and effort in understanding their own biases and becoming, you know, skilling themselves up in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, who could, you know, help moderate small groups around a framework for which folks are going to come together and engage in the dialogue. But again, I think a real key lesson from all of that is do not put your, you know, your folks of color in a position, or your LGBTQ folks in a position that you're asking them to teach your organization about the issues that they face day in and day out, in terms of whether that's being marginalized in your workplace or whether that's being marginalized in your community.
That is great advice. Great advice.
I was going to also chime in. I think Kristen definitely covered it, and I see Jason also added, you know, vulnerability. One of the people I think of that really talks about that well is Brene Brown. I'm sure, Jason, you may be a fan of her too, since you brought up the vulnerability piece. But to kind of tack on the uncomfortable conversations. And so I think one of the things that in a workspace is that it's important for employees to also know that there's a place they can go to have those conversations. Because I'll be honest with you, this year, I've cried more than I've ever cried in my entire life. And I'm very candid of having those conversations with employees to understand that this has been a heavy year. And it's okay. I think it's important that we allow our employees to understand that we're dealing with COVID. We're dealing with a double pandemic. We're dealing with COVID and we're dealing with racial injustice. And so I think that we have to also give our employees resources for them if they're not comfortable talking at work, letting them know that we have employee EAP, we have other resources, and then again, having a space for them to go to within the corporation if they need to have dialogue or if they want to have questions. Because I experienced this too during this year where people are like, well, I don't want to say the wrong thing. And sometimes when I tell people not saying anything, it's just as bad. And so I want to encourage you all to encourage your employees in that sense. And sometimes uncomfortable conversations are important. I have a podcast that I do with one of my girlfriends. It's called Uncomfortable Conversations with Gabby and Chris. And what we're doing is normalizing the conversation about race. She's a white woman, I'm a Black woman, and we have had these conversations for over 15 years. And so we just want to help people understand that. And so with that being said, I wanted to encourage you all to encourage your employees to have those dialogues. Like Kristen said, don't think because someone is a Black millennial that they want to talk about it, or that because someone you assume is part of the LGBTQ community wants to discuss it. You know, so make sure you are intentional where you're having those conversations and allowing employees to have a space to be able to have those conversations, whether they have questions or if they are just having a hard time.
Well, one thing I have learned today is 1 hour does not do this topic justice. But I know people, we are up at our time, and I want to thank our panel. Just each one of you had such great insights, and we were successfully able to get 4 unique insights that really gave us 4 great perspectives and a lot of information. One quick note about our next one. So I mentioned, and Kristen Lampkin, this is perfect for you since you admitted this has been kind of a sad year for you. We're going to celebrate 2020. And while most people think celebrating 2020 means celebrating that it's almost over, we're going to try to look back on maybe some of the things we may have learned about ourselves and our businesses, and maybe try to see the bright side. And we have kind of an interesting guest speaker that will be on for part of it. This guy has written a book called Professional Drinking, and I've listened to a podcast on it. He's excellent. Just actually a lot of good advice. You know, if you have ever been to a restaurant and a business event and you're handed the wine list and you don't know what to do, this guy has some advice that will ease your mind. So it is literally about, in a professional environment, what are ways that you can feel comfortable with alcoholic beverages. But it's also a great primer for the holidays. So we want this one to be fun. We want to end the year on a high note. So I encourage everybody to join us, chime in, and let's reflect and learn, you know, from this past year together. So, and just have a little fun. So with that, thanks to everyone for attending, and thanks in particular for our panelists and all the insights they've provided.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pat, and everyone. Have a great weekend. Enjoy the last blast of summer.
Y'all later.